Welcome. Hello, I'm Robert Ramsay with Barnes Dennick. Thanks for joining us today for another in our series of SOC discussions. Today I'm with Bryan Gayhart, a SOC leader here at Barnes Dennick. Bryan, how are you doing today?
Very good, thank you. Excited to be here.
Thanks for joining me. Today we're talking about SOC 2 Plus. Bryan, when you think of SOC 2 Plus, what comes to mind?
Yeah, for me, SOC 2 Plus is you're adding in another framework. So when the SOC report, when you're kicking that off, that SOC 2, you're starting with security. That's your baseline, right? And then you can add in any of the other criteria: availability, confidentiality, processing integrity, privacy. But then SOC 2 Plus is then some other framework that your company is working to meet, working to achieve. So think of things like ISO 27001, NIST 853, things like that. You're going to add that framework into your SOC report. Robert, how often do you see that being added into SOC reports?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's probably between 10 and 20%. It's definitely growing. 5 years ago it was rarer, and now it's more common. It's nice to be able to add in and get coverage if a company's already living by one of those frameworks, so they can get credit for it without too much effort. Sometimes if we map to those criteria within the SOC report.
Is there one that you see more than others? I know the AI CPA provides several mappings, so I assume those are the more popular ones, but are there any frameworks you see more often than not?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think ISO is increasingly important as the world gets smaller and more companies in Europe do business here and more companies here sell into Europe. We're seeing that as a question quite often.
So let's pick on ISO then, 27001. I know that's a pretty common mapping. There's a lot of overlap for sure. You can get probably 70% of the way there with the SOC report to cover security, and then you've got to figure out the rest. When you're doing the actual work though, what challenges does that create outside of the normal SOC 2 engagement?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a challenge. It's also some of the value add is that 30% difference. So what if they've already got the ISO suite of controls, policies and procedures, what would they need to add for a SOC 2? And the accountants, the AICPA that came up with these have some of their own unique components. And so we make sure they're in there and we add those into the SOC report so that it can be SOC 2 plus ISO.
When you're doing that work, where do you put that in the report? Are you putting that cross-mapping in the opinion? Are you putting it throughout Section 3, the system description typically? Do you have separate controls in Section 4 for it? Or are you just putting it in Section 5 and leaving it alone, almost as if it's from management?
You know, what's nice about the SOC 2 construct that the AICPA came up with is that if it's reasonable and not misleading, there's a lot you can do. So I think all those examples you gave, we've probably done some of each in terms of opining on the SOC 2 criteria, noting that includes some ISO criteria, adding a description of what's going on in Section 3, a disclosure and a report for management, adding controls in Section 4 so that a typical list of maybe SOC 2 controls is longer and more robust. And then you mentioned Section 5 and kind of mapping just to show that, hey, all this work was done and it's very similar to all this other work that's been done. So you can get credit for this in a variety of ways. And so it's kind of fun doing a lot of different things.
In terms of workload, between our workload and the client's workload, where does most of that time fall in? Are we taking on that mapping for our clients? Are the clients taking on that mapping? And then when it comes to the actual evidence gathering, control testing, where does most of that work reside?
Yeah, we're in the professional services business, so we're happy to help as much as needed or reduce costs, and some management teams are happy to do quite a bit themselves. We bring to the table CPAs that are independent and trained and certified to issue these reports, and we also can help with preparing the report and pulling this all together. But that said, their team can often do a big chunk of that too, so we work with our clients depending on availability, time, experience, budget, what makes sense for everybody.
If you've never done a SOC report before, and you have customers and they're asking for a SOC report, they're asking for ISO, it's easy to start. And you start with that mapping and the two come together. What about if I've been doing a SOC report for a number of years and then all of a sudden I get a customer of mine that says, hey, I would like to see ISO 27001. Can we add it in mid-period? Do we add it in at the start of a next period? How does that kind of unfold if we've been doing a SOC report for a number of years?
Yeah, then the SOC reporting and the testing process is down pat, but adding ISO experience and understanding is the big lift. There's expense to that, joining ISO, paying for the rights to use it, evaluating the long list of controls and policies that's typically longer and more involved than the SOC 2. And we can help with that and make that happen.
Have you seen any frameworks that any clients have ever asked about that we just can't map to the SOC report, or does everything map?
You know, one way or another, these are pretty flexible and held to a reasonableness standard. We're able to help with a number of pieces. I know that HECVAT, the Higher Education Cloud Vendor Assessment Tool, has some pieces that are controls that make perfect sense. It has some yes-no questions that maybe you wouldn't call a mapping, but we put it in Section 3 as a disclosure item, so we're able to include quite a bit of that.
Are there any that we can't map because of different reasons? So I think of something like High Trust.
Yeah.
You need a license. You need to kind of register with High Trust and be basically paid for the use. Something like that. Would we be comfortable mapping that, or what's it take to map something where there's a kind of a paid license in place?
Yeah, I mentioned ISO before, how you had to pay for that. We do have to play nice with others, and there are intellectual property rights and copyrights and that kind of thing. So, and they evolve over time. High Trust changes over time, and so they do have a prescribed method of working with them, and then there are less prescribed methods that are to be determined.
If you're considering one of these SOC 2 paths, any advice for people getting started? Where do you go to figure out if you need it or not?
Well, whether you need it or not would probably be if your customers care, right? The readers of these reports. If there's impact and value there, then it's worth going down that path. And like anything else, if you have time to do research in advance, that's great. You can save time and energy. If you're in a huge hurry and you want an expert to help you, you'll call us sooner than later.
We talked a lot about how we help make our clients' lives easier. We handle that mapping, we show them that crosswalk. Anything else we do in our process that makes it easier for clients when they're dealing with the SOC 2 Plus?
We definitely help with best practices, ways that you can get credit for something that's already being done, and kind of taking the shortest path to the finish line. I know you're really good at that. If something's being done but it's not quite documented, we'll advise on how you can capture data so that it can be used in a SOC report, that kind of thing.
I'll ask you one last question. Do you have a favorite mapping that exists? I know we see a whole bunch of them. There's a lot of different ones. The Cloud Star Alliance, I believe, has this giant crosswalk of mappings that seem to be all-encompassing. Do you have a favorite that you've seen?
The funniest one is the German one with 5 long letters that start with C in English. I'm sure the Germans have a 57-syllable version of that. That's one of my favorites. But yeah, I mean, most defense forces in the world have their own version. There are many different kind of quirky. We already mentioned the higher education version. They're kind of fun and interesting depending on who's doing what.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bryan. Thanks for joining us for another video session with Barnes & Dennick SOC team. Call, click, or subscribe, and call us with any questions.